Psychic Pokemon have long been thought as one of the strongest types in competitive, reaching all the way back to their debut in Generation 1. However, with recent generations, this type has fallen from grace, and I want to try and see what the best Psychic types are in competitive. If you guys enjoy and you want to see some more content like this, of course, like and subscribe and answer the comment question of the day. What is your favorite Psychic type to use in competitive this generation? I can't lie, before Regulation C, it definitely was Armourouge. However, there's not really any Psychic types I'm super excited to use this generation, other than, I guess, Screamtail. Screamtail has been super fun, actually. That's going to be my answer. It's been Screamtail, baby. With that said, though, let me know your guys' answers down below, and let's get started with a quick summary of the tiering for today. Going into our tiers for today, let's start off with the S+ tier. For anything in the S+ tier, this is for Pokemon that you actually genuinely hurt your team not running because of how dominant these Pokemon are. This would be the equivalent of running another ground type because you don't like Landorus T, but not because it's actually better for your team than this. The S tiers are going to be still really strong picks, and while there is some drawback to these, they're still good enough to at least kind of justify over an S+, and there's a lot of things that these usually have to offer, usually whether it's through varied movesets or just through a metagame presence, or even some unique trait over an S+. The A tiers are going to be for the last of the Pokemon that you should start to expect in any sort of common team building, and you should at the very least make sure that you don't outright lose to any of these. Making sure that you of course have at least a check or a game plan around these A tiers is important because you'll probably fight several of these in any given laddering session. For the B tiers, these are going to be for Pokemon that you could start outright ignoring for check wise, but you should at least know how you're going to play around these. Into the C tiers, these start to get into more niche Pokemon. These typically will have a specific role or even a top tier Pokemon that they'll check, but otherwise they're pretty forgettable. The D tiers are going to be for YouTuber picks. I might clickbait a video with the Pokemon like these, and we do have a few of really good ones on the list today, but typically though, they're not exactly great Pokemon. However, they're fun enough to where you can make a good gimmick off of. Finally, the F tiers are going to be for Pokemon that are so objectively bad that you really shouldn't be using these because they're not even good enough to make gimmicks work off of. So with that said, let's start off with Alolan Raichu. Now, Alolan Raichu is a pretty interesting one. Initially, I was thinking this would be a lot higher, especially because when I did Electrics, it was still early into Series 2, if I remember correctly, and I thought this Pokemon might actually be a bit better. However, Electric Terrain is still yet to ever really pop off. The best example we've seen of this is on Trick Room, funny enough, which is the exact opposite team comp you want for Alolan Raichu. It's not to say that it's completely unviable, but with a lot of different really strong moves like Rising Voltage and Expanding Force out of its moveset, I can't really put it higher than the D tier. I think regular Raichu this generation is honestly just better, but I'm curious to see if that'll change with the home mon specifically. Moving on to Slowpoke, we actually do have another D tier. I think Slowpoke is weirdly enough better than both Slowbro, Galar Slowbro, and even Slowking this generation. And I would argue that specifically for the Battle Stadium results. I don't think any of these are good enough currently at the moment to really justify any higher tiering for, but I think that all three of these Pokemon for the evolutions all have a couple big things that, unlike regular Slowpoke, they do end up actually having less viability because of. For one, a lot of bulky Trick Room teams do really appreciate having that sort of Citrus Berry item slot, which are Pokemon like, for example, Slowbro, Slowking, and Galar Slowbro all able to run sufficiently. However, though, with Slowpoke at the other hand, at the very least, you can actually run into Violet pretty comfortably. Not only this, but when we consider Slowpoke's speed stat of base 15, it's actually even able to underpace Pokemon like Torkoal, for example, in Trick Room. On top of this as well, you do have some pretty strong support moves that Slowpoke can pull off. For example, with the Trick Room and Yawn, you can obviously pull off some shenaniganry, but you also do have a really slow Heal Pulse Pokemon, which next to a Trick Room threat like Torkoal, you can actually Heal Pulse before you even go for an Eruption, making sure that you could time this as well as possible. I think that Slowbro and its other counterparts, at the very least besides Galar Slowking, definitely do have a lot of other issues in matchups to where I think they're actually a little bit lackluster compared to this. So I definitely am going to put them all in the D tier. I'm going to put the other Slowbro forms and Slowking both below Alolan Raichu, with the order not really mattering here, but I guess if I had to pick, I would probably actually put Slowking highest due to its ability to use Chilly Reception for momentum. Hypno is going to be an F tier. This thing is honestly really bad. It's probably one of the worst Psychic types ever created, but I guess Belly Drum is kind of cool. Galar Articuno can get the C tier. This thing has a few different things going for it. For one, I think it's actually a really good Terra user with Terra Ground, especially being a great option on this. Also, the competitive ability will be huge when home drops, especially with options like Landorus Therian entering the metagame, which will be insane for matchups. However, in general, I think this will be a really good offensive Tailwind option with Tailwind, Freezing Glare, Air Slash, and then Terra Blast fighting, and I think it'll be very hard for most teams to take on, giving it the C tier. Moving on, we do have Mewtwo. I can't lie, Mewtwo gets an S tier. It's gonna get just a regular S tier though. I think that it has a little bit of issues regarding certain mons, and it's honestly just a worse Calyrex. However, it's honestly such a good coverage spread that Mewtwo is really hard to justify any tier lower than the S tier, because when we think about Tailwind options, for example, Mewtwo has a 130 speed, it has some really good bulk, and unlike Calyrex, it's not 4 times weak to anything. However, at the very least, we're gonna have to get into Calyrex Shadow. That's a whole different can of worms, to be completely honest. But Mewtwo is still really good and has 2 really good abilities, insane coverage. Its coverage is a lot better than Calyrex too. But at the same time though, it's a lot less important this generation due to Calyrex having Terra Blast. I think Mewtwo is an S tier specifically among psychic types. However, it's a pretty weak psychic type in the S tier for sure. And I do think that as far as box art psychic types go, this is one of the worst. Moving on to Mew. Mew honestly is pretty lackluster. Mew is not really a strong Pokemon in VGC. Having 100 all around is not that great. Typically, a lot of the other Pixies are better. For example, if we pull up Manaphy, while Manaphy isn't in the game necessarily, Manaphy at the very least has a lot better of a defensive typing for this format, and also would have access to moves like Tail Glow potentially. Even if we get into less speculative ones though, Pokemon like Jirachi, for example, with stuff like Doom Desire would definitely be a lot more potent in my opinion. So I'm gonna actually give Mew a C tier. I think that it's just lackluster enough, especially without a lot of these tutors, that I can't really justify it any higher. However, it does still have some good support like Tailwind, Heal Pulse. I think it gets Helping Hand as well, if I remember correctly. Yes, it does. Okay, so yeah, you can get a C tier. It's just kind of a 4 moveset syndrome Pokemon in my opinion. Espeon is kind of shit, but Magic Bounce is at least kind of okay. We'll give this thing a D tier. It's going to be at the very bottom of D tier though, purely just because of Magic Bounce being that okay of an ability. And, well, not that okay. It's actually a really good ability, but Espeon's stats or whatever for it, its speed is really the one thing it carries this thing. Galar Slowking is going to get the C tier. I'm actually putting this at the top of C tier. The typing is really strong, and I think with an option like Terra Cross, for example, this could actually make a pretty good trigger bet. Specifically, I think with stuff like Eerie Spell being a really good way to stall break for teams and make sure that opponents aren't getting the coverage they need, and especially with Terrestrial, you can use that Eerie Spell to your advantage a lot better this generation, in my opinion. So at the very least, I do think that this is definitely a C tier pick. Girafarig. Up next, we have the NFE for one of the best psychic types this generation, and I think it's actually still an okay Pokemon. Girafarig does have a few things going for it, such as the Violet item, which similar to Slowpoke at the very least is a pretty decent distinction. Also, with the abilities that it has being Inner Focus, Early Bird, and Zap Zipper, while these are significantly worse than Ferrograph's abilities, I do think these are at the very least not bad options. It also has a lot of good support, but at the same time though, the typing and highest base stat being base 90 special attack, I don't really think is going to be that great for it. We're going to still put it in the D tier though. I do think at the very least this ranks above Espeon, but it's not much better. Moving on to Gardevoir, we actually have our first B tier psychic type. Now, I think that Gardevoir has honestly proven to be a really strong meta presence in my opinion this generation. It's a really good Imprison Pokemon, and it has a lot of good support moves like Icy Wind, Trick Room, and many, many more, to where it can not only be a great support piece with thanks to its really strong special bulk, but also Gardevoir can actually be a really good offensive monster. With the Choice Scarf and base 80 speed, if you throw this thing on Tailwind, you can actually be surprisingly fast. And not only this, but with your coverage with moves like Dazzling Gleam and Psychic, as well as the option to trick away your Scarf altogether, this actually proves to be a really strong Pokemon in my opinion, and easily deserves the B tier. Moving on, we do have Medicham now. And Medicham is honestly a pretty good Trick Room threat with the ability to skill swap its huge power onto other really strong physical attackers, making it into a really strong support piece instead of an offensive monster you would typically see in singles. I think Medicham actually deserves a C tier at the very least. I would even go as far as putting it above Mew. However, I think that mons like Galar Articuno and Galar Slowking both do prove to be a little bit more potent on paper at the very least, especially with Terra, so I'm going to end up putting Medicham just right below these in the C tier. Grumpig is pretty bad. We don't need to talk about this mon. We can actually just pretend it doesn't exist, and we can move on instead to Bronzong, which is also going to get the B tier. I do think that Bronzong is actually a pretty prolific Trick Room setter as of Series 3, and it's one of those things where Bronzong always starts out lackluster, but it will never be an unviable Pokemon. Due to the fact that it has a really good stat spread, the ability to Terra into any type you want also really helps at this gen, and with 2 different abilities that can help with weaknesses, whether it's Levitate or even Heat Proof, I think it's pretty hard to make Bronzong actually inviable. This thing has never once had a really bad format in my opinion, and I'm curious to see when that will actually come. Gallade is also in the B tier. This thing is going to go right above Gardevoir. The biggest thing that Gallade has over Gardevoir is the fact that despite them having pretty similar toolkits, I think that Gallade being able to be a really strong dozo check thanks to moves like, for example, actually, never mind. I say that, but Trace Gardevoir actually would be a better Doza check. We're actually going to put Gardevoir and Gallade. They're pretty even. I think Gardevoir is slightly better for this format, though, due to the fact that it's not worrying about physical attackers and other competition there, and also the fact that I think the Fairy typing is a little bit better suited. But Gallade is still a pretty strong option nonetheless. Scope Lens sets as well as Assault Vest sets are both really good. This is an amazing Tara option. However, it's usually a 6 mon on teams. Moving on to Uxie, Azelf, and Mesprit are all kind of bad. However, Azelf at the very least can get a C tier due to its strong speed and the fact that this can be a really strong option with mystical power. We'll put the Mesprit and in the D tier, at least above Girafarig, and we're going to put Uxie at the high end of D tier, right above Alolan Raichu. Uxie and Mesprit are pretty similar. I think that Mesprit is just a slightly more offensive version of Uxie without options like Yawn, though it does instead have moves like Mystical Power to be good. Uxie has this as well, but I think that Uxie's kit allows itself to be a lot better suited for defensive roles, like with Yawn, Helping Hand, and moves like that. At the same time, though, its stat of 95 speed for Trick Room setting, while it can be done with Pokemon like Mimikyu, it's just not the best, especially on a Pokemon that's as passive as Uxie is, because its best way to really clear anything is by going for Yawn. Whereas at least a Pokemon like Mimikyu, though, would be able to just outright put offensive pressure on faster threats. Next up, we have Cresselia. Now, Cresselia is one that, honestly, I slept on this a lot, but I heard apparently this is a monster in Double ZOU, so I'm going to have to respect it. Cresselia, I will say as well, has one really good thing going for it, being the fact that the Lunar Blessing move is apparently really, really cracked. Specifically, what this move ends up doing, for anyone who is unaware, this thing heals up both the allies and itself by 1/4, and it also cures their stats. So this is essentially like jungle healing, but it's on a Pokemon that we can actually use in competitive whenever the whole months drop. On top of this as well, Cresselia has significantly better bulk than a Pokemon like Zarude. You have incredible support both in Trick Room with stuff like Trick Room as well as Helping Hand, as well as outside of Trick Room with moves like Thunder Wave and Icy Wind still being great speed control. Cresselia's kit also has moves like Ally Switch, which on a Pokemon this bulky is incredibly annoying to deal with, especially when you have to consider immunity when you're trying to use this Pokemon to maybe switch around a Pokemon like Great Tusk. And overall, Cresselia proves to be an absolute terrifying threat. I would be remiss to put Cresselia anywhere below the S tier at the very least. I'm going to put it on the lower end. I know it's higher than Mewtwo right now, but Mewtwo is going to be at the outright bottom of S tier. But I am curious to see if Cresselia will end up picking up later on. Moving on to Arceus Psychic, this is definitely a lower end Psychic type for sure. It's at least above Mewtwo just due to the fact that it's a lot bulkier than Mewtwo, and overall, I feel like that it has a slight better actually, no, Mewtwo's ability I have on Nerve is definitely better, I would say, actually. But Arceus is just a shitty Mewtwo, actually, thinking out loud. Because at the very least, Mewtwo can hold items, such as Life Orb. You have an outright usable ability instead of just multi-type. So yeah, honestly, yeah, Mewtwo is just a better version of Arceus, and I already said my complaints about Mewtwo. They're pretty much the same. Arceus is just slower, and it also, on top of that, has no good offensive ability. So, yep, Arceus is S tier. Moving on, we do have Gothrita, which I'm going to actually put in the top of D tier. Gothrita is essentially Gothitelle, but it doesn't need to compete with an item slot such as Citrus Berry, Agua Berry, or even a Mental Herb. On top of this as well, Gothitelle also being such a prolific Pokemon thanks to trapping in this gen, makes Gothrita still really valuable here because you don't really need it for an offensive Pokemon in any case. Typically, you're using this Pokemon for really good support with moves like Heal Pulse, Trick Room, and any other really good status move. Essentially, Gothrita can just do Gothitelle's job, but it has a slightly worse offensive stat, which doesn't really matter. However, Gothitelle, at the same time though, being able to have this recovery through the Citrus Berry, as well as the fact that it is typically a lot more bringable to games than Gothrita, despite them both putting up the same sort of pressure against most Pokemon, I think Gothrita is going to get in the S tier, and I'm going to put it right above Mewtwo. I think this has been the best gen that Gothrita has ever had, and I think that a couple key things do end up actually giving Gothrita the advantage here. For one, despite the fact that neither Pokemon really do typically run offensive moves outside of maybe like a Foul Play or a Psychic, Gothitelle having a little bit more in its offense definitely does help out in this regard, making Psychic and Psyshock a little more viable here. On top of this as well, having the ability to actually run a Recovery Berry is pretty huge, because Gothrita would typically just need to go for outright force status sets to make itself work, and on top of this as well, you'd probably need to go for a Tire Dark just to make sure that you're not Prankster Taunt fodder. Other than this though, I think that Gothrita is still fairly viable. I just think that Gothitelle does what Gothrita does, but it does it with a lot higher of a skill ceiling, making Gothitelle an easy S tier. Braviary Hisuian form is also going to easily get in the C tier, just like with Galar Articuno. However, I think on further reflection that this is actually going to be slightly better. I think that Hisuian Braviary will be really good specifically due to one key move, Esper Wing, which is a 100% chance to raise speed by one stage as well as a high crit rate. I think this will function similar to Gallade, where you'll run this thing on a Scope Lens set with moves like Esper Wing, Hurricane, Heat Wave, and then Protect, and maybe go for like a Terra Fire build. Or on the flip side, you could always go for a Terra Fighting moveset, then feature Terra Blast on this instead of Heat Wave, or even just overall with the 4 attacks. Overall, I think Hisuian Braviary will be really good, and especially with the ability Tinted Lens, as well as the ability Sheer Force, it's kind of hard to see this Pokemon being bad, because if you want to run a move like Esper Wing or Psychic, you can easily throw this thing on a Trick Room team and just go for Esper Wing or Psychic and deal damage. Meanwhile, if you want to make this thing a really fast offensive threat, throw it with Tinted Lens and then just start spamming Esper Wing. Definitely a really good Pokemon. I'm curious to see how it does, but it's going to get the C tier for now. Moving on to Meloetta, this is also going to get the C tier. I'm putting this right below Medicham just because of the fact this is a normal Psychic type, which has some good immunities to stuff like Ghost, but at the same time though, Meloetta's stats are kind of underwhelming, without any really good distinction here for a speed stat, as well as the fact that its best stat is really just Speed F and Special Attack, both of which are kind of fine until you realize that one of your best options in VGC would probably be the move Relic Song in order to get the 20% chance to put things to sleep while also transforming your speed stat. And then Meloetta has to turn into a mixed attacker to make this work. So, I don't know. I feel like that Meloetta is definitely kind of just in a weird place. It's not terrible, but I think it's just really awkward to run on most teams. So, we're going to give it a C tier. Delphox is up next, and I think Delphox is definitely going to get a D tier. We're going to put this Pokemon right above Mesprit. I think, actually, we're going to put it right above this, at least the Slowbro, not the Slow King. Delphox has a really good speed stat of 104, and I think this could actually be a really good threat with Terra Fairy, specifically with a Life Orb build, and probably just going with like Dazzling Gleam, Stabs, and then Protect. Overall, Delphox is kind of just outclassed by a lot of different fast special threats, but at the same time though, I do think that abilities like Blaze and Magician do at least kind of have a place in this Pokemon, and it's just fast enough to work on Tailwind. Moving on to Hoopa, I actually think that Hoopa is going to get like the bottom of C tier. This thing is a pretty interesting Pokemon thanks to Terastal, to where you can maybe make this into a Terra Fighting type, and not only get rid of your 4x weakness to Dark and Ghost, but outright start pressuring the Dark types at the very least. Ghost would still be pressured by your Ghost Stab anyway, so it's not really something you need to gain a coverage for, but no longer needing to use moves like Focus Blast will actually be really incredible for Hoopa's case specifically. I could totally see this thing pulling off an Assault Vest set, or even just like a Choice Spec set, and being a really good Trick Room monster. So I'm actually gonna put this thing higher in C tier. I'm gonna put this thing I'm gonna put this at the top of C tier actually. I think Hoopa will be an interesting Trick Room threat. I could even see a moveset with like Room Service working with Terra Fighting, but I don't want to get too carried away yet. Bombirdier is the only Pokemon to really make it 5 the work so far, besides me preaching some Flora, and even then it's not exactly a great threat. Hoopa and Bound, I'm actually gonna give the B tier though, and I'll put it at the bottom of B. Hoopa and Bound has a couple things going for it. For one, it's a lot more physically offensive, which means you could run movesets on mixed sets, or even just fully physical or special. I could totally see Hoopa and Bound especially being a threat on our closed sheet format if it was ever to be illegal. And with the base 80 speed, similar to Gardevoir, this also makes for a really good Scarf speed tier, but it can still be slow enough to where it's just barely viable in Trick Room. Having the signature move as well with Hyperspace Fury that not only breaks Protect, but it also lowers the user's defense by 1 is a really strong threatening move. And despite the defense drop, it doesn't really matter because Hoopa is so physically frail anyway, that being able to just shatter Protect with a really strong 100 base power, no way to dodge this thing due to the fact it's perfect accuracy, Dark Attack. This is a really strong offensive threat, and I definitely do think that it is a monster in terms of competitive. I'm curious to see how this thing does. It's definitely a B tier. Oranguru is also going to get the B tier. I'm putting this thing right above Gallade, actually right above Gardevoir as well. With the move Instruct, this thing can make mons like Torkoal really terrifying, or even Pokemon like Bellybolt, which can spam Parabolic Charge next to a Telepathy moveset. Oranguru, I think, is honestly the best Trick Room setter for enabling Cheese, but it can still actually have a really high ceiling outside of that. I just think that it's really free to make a Pokemon that's just barely missing out on KO suddenly KO everything. So we're going to give Oranguru the B tier. It's a really good enabler for a lot of things, and it's kind of hard to kill. If you play your guards right, this is an absolute monster. Moving on to Oricorio, this is honestly the worst Oricorio. I forgot where I put this thing on Flying, but I think I'm going to put this thing at the top of F tier, to be completely honest. Wherever I put this thing on Flying, it probably wasn't correct. I think that realistically, this is the only Oricorio that is genuinely necessary for Terra, because you kind of do need like the Terra Fighting or something of that sort just to handle Steel types. On top of this as well, while Quiver Dance is fine, this Oricorio form is just really hard to pull off in the current metagame due to how many Dark types exist. We're going to give it the F tier. Moving on to Bruxish, my rating for this is not influenced by the Quaquaval video. My rating for this is not influenced by the Quaquaval video. My rating for this is not influenced by the Quaquaval video. This mod is actually kind of fine. Objectively, blocking priority is really good. I know that I had to lead it off with that, but I'm still salty I lost to Bruxish Cole. Realistically though, this is kind of fine. Blocking priority is never a bad thing. This thing has a really good speed steer. With screens being fairly good this gen 2, having stuff like Psychic Fangs is pretty good. It's objectively a D tier. It's kind of a funny mon, but it's not like super meta. Moving on to Indeedee Male. Indeedee Male gets the bottom of C tier because of the fact that it can have Psychic Surge. It's pretty good. But it is not Indeedee Female, which is the best S tier. And I would argue this thing is a pretty fringe S+, but I'm kind of hesitant. The biggest reason being is when we start to look into actual S pluses, I feel like Indeedee just does not fit with those. However, I think that in most other types this could have maybe been the case. I'm going to lean on this thing for now just being the top of S+. Indeedee Male having really strong support like Heal Pulse, Helping Hand, Trick Room, Follow Me. It's one of the only Follow Me Pokemon in the entire game, and being able to block priority with Psychic Terrain is really valuable. I think Indeedee Male is a really strong option for Trick Room. It's probably the best setter that you can get this generation, and it's an easy S tier. Hatterene is going to be an A tier. This thing has actually found some really good love this generation thanks to Terrastal, as well as the ability to pair with Indeedee as a really good Psychic Spam core, despite missing out on Expanding Force. On top of this as well, Hatterene having the Magic Bounce ability, a lot better of a stat spread, and really good items like Assault Vest or even Life Orb to make work for offensive sets and really just fast sets. I think Hatterene is definitely a Pokemon that I think we'll continue to see usage in the format. For now though, it's definitely been It's a weak A tier for what it's worth, but I think it's good enough to where it can make it. Calyrex sucks. It's the worst Psychic type ever created. Calyrex Ice, S+. Calyrex Ghost, S+, but better. These two right here are why I was so fucking concerned with putting Indeedee into the S+ tier. Indeedee Female, despite being a really good Pokemon, looks kind of like a shit show compared to these, but Indeedee Female is a really good Pokemon to support us nonetheless. These two are just so broken offensively, with Calyrex Ice being a monster in Trick Room and Calyrex Shadow being just a monster on most playstyles. Especially next to Indeedee Female, Calyrex Shadow is a really terrifying Pokemon because of the fact that you can block common priority moves like Shadow Sneak or Sucker Punch for it, and you probably wouldn't even need to Terra at that point. On top of this as well, with Astral Barrage and Glacial Lance both being really strong spread options, it's kind of hard to say that this Pokemon suddenly will not just be an objective monster. If this thing still got Expanding Force, I'm going to be honest, I think Calyrex Shadow might genuinely deserve like an S++ tier, but it's pretty close even without that, and it's going to be a monster Terrastal-wise. They're both definitely S pluses though. This one is close to just getting its own tier. Weirder is up next. Weirder is an interesting one. I'm going to put this thing in the bottom. Actually, I'm going to put this thing right above Meloetta in the C tier. Having Intimidate is pretty good, and it has good enough bulk to get by with some really okay support options. But at the same time, though, I think a Weirder I don't know, it just feels like it's just missing something. I think it's honestly a little bit too non-offensive to be a really good offensive threat. On top of this as well, it's a little bit too not bulky to be a really good bulky Pokemon. It's a little bit too fast to be like a really meta-defining Trick Room option, and unlike Indeedee Female, it doesn't block priority either. Same for Cresselia, which just has insanely gross bulk. Weirder doesn't have that. But it has like a really good hodgepodge of like every kind of viable Trick Room option, so we'll give this thing a C tier. Ravska is kind of cool. I think Ravska still doesn't get the attention it deserves. I'm giving this thing the very bottom of C tier, purely because of Revival Blessing. The move is fucking cracked. It's just not a Pokemon that has really lackluster stats. But with Ravska having like a base 40 something in speed, 45 speed with a really good offensive stat, this is a pretty good Terra option. It's bulky enough with like Terra Water, or you can maybe go with an offensive Terra option and do some work. I don't want to say this thing is like a really good Pokemon, but it's objectively like a fine enough Pokemon with a really broken move. So we'll give this thing a C tier. Asparathur can get the B tier. This thing objectively can slot right above Gardevoir. Speed boost is really good, and you can make sets like Lumina Crash with screens really strong, as well as the Gravity Hypnosis sets next to Sandy Shocks, both of which are absolutely terrifying. Asparathur is objectively just a really good cheese Pokemon. It makes any sort of gimmick strat work really well, and yeah, this thing can honestly just get the B tier for sure. Fergraph is going to get the A tier. This thing blocking priority is really huge, and it's honestly probably one of the best priority blockers to do so, specifically because of the fact that despite that Indeedee Female is a lot more viable as a Trick Room setter due to its support toolkit and moves like Follow Me, Fergraph having the ability to block priority for only your opponent, unlike yourself, means that you can run this next to Pokemon like King Gambit. And on top of that as well, if you can play your cards out against threats like Chien-Pao, this thing can even just start making Chien-Pao outright inviable next to a slower Pokemon, whether you have Trick Room up or not. On top of this as well, speaking of Chien-Pao, you can't actually Ice Spinner the ability away because with Indeedee, you can Ice Spinner the terrain. So if you're specifically looking only to block priority, I do think the Fergraph is the best Pokemon for this. However, at the same time, there's a big caveat here because I think that Indeedee is a better Pokemon to make this work, which is why I think that Fergraph is still in the A tier, just misses out on a lot of good support. And truthfully, if this thing had Follow Me, I think this would be like the best S tier for sure, but it just misses out. Moving on to Veluza. I really hate that I have to put this thing low. Randy's gonna kill me. I'm gonna at least give it the D tier if that helps Randy. We'll put this thing right above like Mesprit. This thing is kind of cool. The sharpness ability as well as the signature move is honestly really fucking cool, and you can make this thing work on size spam in my opinion. I don't know. I mean, it's typing at the very least means you can handle Pokemon like Chiyu and also Tinglu, which is kind of good. Wo-Chan's not really existent, which is great because it'd be the best counter to you, and you at least have a neutral option of hitting Chien-Pao. This thing could definitely snowball with Fillet Away, but it's just kind of an issue of pulling it off. Though, again, with something like Size Spam or even like next to a Mouse Hold, you could definitely pull this off. It's just really fucking gimmicky. So we'll give this thing a D tier. Screamtail is an objective A tier. I think that Screamtail is the second best A tier personally. I think the Furgraf having the ability to block priority is still really huge for it, but at the same time, Screamtail having a really good support kit, whether you're going for Trick Room, Encore Disable, even Howl sets are really good. Boost Energy Speed, whether you're running Trick Room or anything else, is honestly a really good tech to run on this Pokemon just because of the fact that this is a really good support kit. And yeah, honestly, the typing is incredible. It's really bulky. It doesn't need to be offensive, but even thanks to your Howl support for other Pokemon, you could make this into a weirdly good offensive Pokemon, even with stuff like Psychic Fangs breaking screens for your team, or even Drain Punch to handle Chien-Pao matchups. Iron Leaves. Iron Leaves is a really good kit. I think overall this thing actually can get the A tier, to be completely honest. I think Iron Leaves at the bottom of A makes sense. It's going to be a really good tailwind threat, and I think that with the ability to check Pokemon like Great Tusk really easily, this will at least see some usage. On top of this as well, it's a great dozo check on the physical end, and it's going to be a lot more consistent than Gallade. With the moves Psyblade as well, you can throw this on a dual terrain team with stuff like Indeedee and Pincurchin, and either gain the speed boost with the Pincurchin thanks to your Quark Drive, or even just the attack boost to deal more damage. But you also have Psyblade with the Psychic Terrain, which will still get boosted by Psychic Terrain, on top of also the fact that you'll block priority. Overall, I think Iron Leaves will be pretty good. It's going to be kind of unique, but I think it'll be a really strong Terra option nonetheless, and it's going to fit really well into teams that do end up running it. I just think it's going to be a little bit hard to justify over other Paradox monsters all. Armourouge is going to be our final Pokemon of the day, and this objectively can get an S tier. I'm going to give this thing right below Gothrita. I think that once all the Dark types came in the format, despite Armourouge still being a fairly good Pokemon, this thing just kind of got a bit outclassed. It's not to say that Armourouge is really terrible by any means, but with I guess the biggest benefit is the fact that it's the only expanding force user. That's kind of the only reason it sees usage, is because nothing else better gets expanding force. However, with options like Flash Fire, as well as the ability to Trustle into a grass type or a steel type and gain that fire type immunity, it's really hard to not put this thing in the S tier. I just think that it's, of the non-legend S tiers, definitely the worst one, because Pokemon like Gothitelle still can put a lot of pressure on matchups with heavy dark type teams, and Indeedee is really good at blocking priority, and on top of that as well, Cresselia is just so cracked thanks to Lunar Blessing, that I think that all three of these definitely deserve their spots over it. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below, and if you guys enjoy this list and you want to see some more content like it, of course, make sure you like and subscribe, and answer the comment question of the day: what is your favorite Psychic type to use in competitive? With that said, shout out to our channel members, of course. Your guys' support is greatly appreciated, being Josh K. Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Bbat, Anna Depur, Timo Mueller, Fonzie, Bam Bambi, Rao Plays, Obo, and Johannes B. Your guys' support on the channel is, of course, greatly appreciated. And if you want to join all of our wonderful channel members, it's down right below with the join button, only a couple dollars a month. Also, massive shout outs to Kurt. He did a wonderful job editing this as always, and I will see you guys in the next video on Monday. Until then, peace out, guys.